Bibles or your Bible apps in front of you, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5 today. I'm just giving you that ahead of time so you can go ahead and kind of flip there and get yourself ready. We've been diving into this moment, right? We've been unpacking this moment over the last few weeks, following Jesus as he began his ministry. Kind of the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry, he goes up on this hillside in a place called Galilee, which is in the northern part of Israel, and he speaks to a crowd. And this crowd consisted of the most outcast, the most disqualified, marginalized people in the world, right? These are some of the most disqualified, outcast, and marginalized people in Jesus' culture and really in the world. And what that tells us right off the bat is that the marginalized, the outcast, and the disqualified, that's who Jesus sought after. But it's also because these people came out to hear Jesus speak, it's also those that sought after Jesus. So you've got this kind of Jesus and this group of people that are kind of seeking each other out, right? And they meet up on this hillside where Jesus begins to teach and preach about his kingdom. And we've come to know and kind of refer to this as the Sermon on the Mount. And what the Sermon on the Mount is really the moment where Jesus ushers in this new kind of kingdom. And with this new kind of kingdom comes a new kind of kingdom citizenship, where those that belong to this kingdom, like we ask, well, who can belong to Jesus' kingdom? Jesus says this: anyone and everyone who repents and believes. Anyone and everyone who is willing to rethink and reconsider the way that they're living their life and turn towards Jesus for the truth, right? For reality when it comes to this is what life is all about and this is what life looks like. To turn away from all of the other things that we seek for that kind of wisdom and counsel and turn towards Jesus and begin to rethink and reconsider our lives based on his truth. And with this new kingdom citizenship comes a new kingdom culture, right? Those who repent and believe can now live from, not for, blessing and goodness. And that's how Jesus' kingdom culture works. We live from and out of blessing and goodness, right? Whereas the world's culture would say you must live for blessing and goodness. And the only way you get it is if you do all this stuff right. Jesus says, no, in my kingdom, you live from blessing and goodness. With a new kingdom, we found comes this new kingdom calling, where everyone in Jesus' kingdom has this kind of newfound, overarching, overriding meaning and purpose in their lives, and that is to advance Jesus' kingdom by being what he calls salt and light, being something that is recognizable. That your life and how your life operates, just like salt has a recognizable flavor, and like light is recognizable in dark places, Jesus says your life should be recognizably different than the rest of the way that the world functions and operates. This is your overriding, overarching meaning and purpose in your life, is to live your life differently. And then what we learned last week is that as new as everything in Jesus' kingdom can kind of seem and look on the surface, it's actually what God had in mind from the very beginning when it comes to his relationship with people. See, Jesus didn't come to tear down or dismantle God's wisdom, God's will, and God's desire for a relationship with us. Jesus actually came to make that happen. And when Jesus talks about his kingdom, he says, it's now. You can begin to live this kingdom life. You can begin to live the way that God would desire you to live, the way that he's wanted you to live in this relationship with him from the very beginning of time. You can begin to live that way now. And Jesus, the way he does that is he calls us up to live in and live from and live for something greater than the systems and structures of the world. And so really when you look at kind of the beginning of Jesus' ministry, which really starts in the last half of Matthew chapter 4, and then the first 20 or so verses in Matthew chapter 5, these are essentially kind of like the preamble of Jesus' kingdom constitution. And if you go to the U.S. Constitution's website, here's what you'll find when it comes to like the purpose of a preamble. The preamble's purpose, kind of the beginning of the Constitution, its purpose is to summarize the Constitution's intentions and its underlying values. The beginning of this Constitution, which by the way, the word constitution, to constitute something means to create something, to establish something, and form something. right? So the preamble, right, it's saying, hey, this is what Jesus is saying. This is what I'm creating. This is what I'm establishing. This is what I'm forming. It forms a primer for what to expect as the Constitution follows, right? In the Constitution, all the information is going to follow. The preamble says, this is where we're going, right? So in the same way, when we read what Jesus says and when we see what Jesus does towards the end of Matthew chapter 4 and the first 20 or so verses of Matthew chapter 5, you can kind of begin to see that this is Jesus' we the kingdom Constitution preamble. And it would go like this: we the kingdom, who have turned our lives toward and over to Jesus, who live from the blessing of the King, not for the blessings of the world. We are called by the King to devote our lives to the eternal meaning and purpose of advancing his kingdom and the lives of those around us. And we do that by living out a higher standard of life that's far above and beyond the systems of this world, because it's rooted in God's eternal wisdom, will, and want for the people that he loves. That's the preamble of the Kingdom Constitution. That's the first 20 or so verses of Matthew chapter 5 summed up in just a few sentences, and that sets the foundation for everything that's going to follow. See, in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, what he's doing is he's providing the primer for life in his kingdom. What Jesus is doing and what we've been talking about is the fact that Jesus brings kingdom clarity into the midst of cultural chaos and confusion. And what he does is he unpacks, right, what kingdom citizens, people that want to live in Jesus' kingdom, right, what the citizens can expect from the king and what the king then expects of his kingdom citizens. Here's what it looks like. And so in just a few paragraphs, Jesus gives people like us a glimpse into the heartbeat of heaven. He gives us a snapshot. He brings clarity right to the truth of what heaven is all about and who God's heart beats for. And the answer to that question is you, me, us. Right? That's who God's heart beats for. Now, let me just say this, side note, just so I can be clear on this. I'm not implying that Jesus drew his inspiration for the Sermon on the Mount from the founders of the United States, right? Let's just be clear, right? That's not what I'm saying. It's like, wow, Jesus, like, he really drew some inspiration from these guys. What I am saying is that the preamble of the Constitution and the way that Jesus begins his Sermon on the Mount serve similar purposes, right? In both forming and establishing something new, and then also clarifying and defining and describing what it is. And so I'll just say this, church, it's really important that we get those in the right order. It's important that we understand that it's Jesus and kingdom first, and it's country and culture somewhere else on the list, right? A distant second, maybe. See, the wrong order, by putting country and culture first and Jesus' kingdom and him being the king, putting that second or somewhere else on the list, that results in stuff like Christian nationalism, which is really a form of idolatry, which we're about to find out here in a couple weeks, that Jesus has some really strong feelings about idolatry, right? So we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. We'll leave that there, and then we'll just keep moving, okay? Here's where I'm going with this. Today, what we are doing is we are, as we go through the Sermon on the Mount, we are leaving the kingdom preamble, and we're actually getting into the law portion of Jesus' kingdom constitution. What Jesus is about to do is he's going to make 6 legal statements that outline and create these clear guardrails for what actually living out the values of his kingdom looks like through our lives, right? So over the next 28 verses, right, you can kind of consider this to be like Jesus' kingdom's Bill of Rights, right? So you got your Bibles in front of you. Grab those, open up to Matthew chapter 5. I'm going to get another drink of water. I'm on like 4 different allergy medicines right now. Anybody else, right? Okay, cool. We'll talk afterwards, right? We'll support group. We'll pray for each other and our allergies, right? Here's what it says, starting in verse 21. Jesus says, "You've heard it said. You've heard that it was said to those of old." And when Jesus says this, you've heard what it was said to those of old. He's talking about the fact that the law, right, the 10 Commandments, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, those are over 1,000 years old at this point. So for the people listening to Jesus, when he starts to talk about the law, it would have been something that they would have said, like, yeah, that's an old law. That law's been around for a while, right? So he said, you've heard it said to those of old, those who lived over 1,000 years ago, it was said by God to them, you shall not murder. Whoever murders will be liable to judgment. So there's time out right here. That's one of God's big 10. It's one of the 10 commandments. And I think sometimes we get it confused. Sometimes you'll hear people say, it's like, you shall not kill. It's not you shall not kill, it's you shall not murder. And when you look into kind of what that ancient Hebrew word means, it literally means do not take human life intentionally or through like carelessness or negligence. What this really implies is when you show little care for another life, whether you intentionally don't care about that person's life or unintentionally you just kind of don't care, and through your own negligence someone else, their life is taken from them, the result is judgment. There's legal consequences for violating the law. When you take the life of another human being because either you didn't care enough about them so you decided to take it on purpose, or you didn't care enough about them that it was an accident but their life is now gone, they're dead. There's judgment, right? There's consequences for violating this law. And people listening to Jesus would have gone, yeah, we've heard that said, and we know that there are consequences for violating that law. And he goes on, he says this, but I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. That judgment Jesus refers to as kind of the local court system. And then he goes on, he says, whoever insults his brother, right, which is the Greek word raka, which means you're good for nothing, you're worthless, you're empty. Whoever throws that kind of an insult at their friend or at their brother or at another person will be liable to the council, right? The religious council would have been comparative to kind of our Supreme Court. So it's like the local court, the Supreme Court, and then Jesus says this, whoever says, you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire, the supernatural or sovereign court. So Jesus says, if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. He says, truly I say to you, you'll never get out until you have paid the last penny. And this is kind of interesting. Back in Jesus' day, they would have these things called debtors' prisons. And a debtor's prison was, let's say I owed someone a debt that I couldn't pay back. What they would do is they would lock up my family. They would lock up my family in prison and then put me to work working off that debt, right, which interest would accrue, right? And so my family could not be released until I worked off that debt until that entire debt was paid back. Or they would flip it. Sometimes they would lock up the person that actually owed the debt and then make their family work to pay off somebody else's debt. I mean, that existed in Jesus' day. So listen, you're not getting out of prison until those that you love have paid off your debt, have taken responsibility for your irresponsibility. You're not getting out until that happens. So in these verses, right, there's kind of two main pieces to this. The first is the legal part. And the legal part, right, that kind of reveals what we can expect from Jesus regarding his care and his concern for us, right? That's what Jesus is showing us. He's showing us by calling us to a higher standard. Listen, my care and my concern is for you and the way that you live, right? That's the legal piece. Then the second part of this is the life application part, and what that reveals is Jesus' expectations of us when it comes to our level of care and concern for other people. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to take this one part at a time. And the first part is the law. It's the legal piece. And Jesus, again, he starts by restating what was stated over 1,000 years ago by God. Don't murder. And Jesus would say, I agree with that. Remember what Jesus just got finished saying. We talked about this last week. Jesus says, I'm not here to dismantle. I'm not here to undo or tear down the ancient law. I'm here to enhance that, to call you up to something greater, to reveal this kind of deeper meaning and true intent behind that law. And something I said last week was this: the Pharisees, who would have been kind of considered the conservatives of Jesus' day. See, for the Pharisees, who were kind of the keepers of religious law, the law had become more about technicalities and less about truth. And so the technicality of this law, don't murder, right, according to the Pharisees was this: you are technically living in God's will as long as you can go, as long as you can continue to live without murdering another person. Technically, you're in God's will. Technically, you're doing the things that you need to do. And let's just be honest. I think for most of us, that's probably not a hard one. Right? Some of the 10 Commandments, they can be a little difficult, right? Especially like, honor your father and mother, right? Yeah, some of those can be difficult. This one's not really a hard one. I was going to ask for like show of hands, how many have kept this one? But then that would get really awkward. If someone next to you was like, well, it's like, kind of scoot over a little bit, right? My guess is, though, most of us have probably followed this one pretty well. Don't murder. Technically, we've done what God has asked us to do, but Jesus' kingdom doesn't stand on technicalities. It stands on truth, which is why Jesus raises the standard way higher by connecting murder to anger. Tim Mackey, who runs this podcast called The Bible Project, he explains it like this. He says, the true reason behind God's issue with taking someone else's life, murder, isn't just that you took a life, right, that he made. It's also that you thought so little of another person's life that you actually thought you could take it. In other words, it's not just the act of committing murder that Jesus cares about. He cares about that. But it's also the condition of our hearts and our minds that leads us to devalue the life of another person to the point that we feel like we could end their life or take it. See, according to Jesus, you may not have actually technically murdered another person, but you thought so little of them that you gossiped about them in your office. You didn't physically kill them, but to your coworkers and their coworkers, you assassinated their character. You had such little value for that person that you maybe insulted them in front of their family or in front of their friends. You may not have actually physically hurt them, but you wounded them in ways that were unseen. You maybe technically you didn't make an attempt on their life, but you had such little value for them that you made fun of them. You called them stupid in your latest social media post. You may not have actually tried to take their life, but you did tear them down. One quote I read this week says that when we give ourselves over to sinful anger towards another person, we devalue a human soul and thus the one who made it. So the truth in all of this is this. In Jesus' kingdom, we cross the line when our anger leads us to devalue another person, which is entirely based on our incorrect assumption that we have the authority to determine and declare the worth and value of another person. The reality is their true worth and value, that's not up to us to decide, right? That's God's responsibility. And he rightfully takes it personally when we declare that the life of someone that he made has no value. Which is why Jesus gets really specific about the kinds of actions and the kinds of words that get aimed and fired at another person when we get angry. And I'll be honest, this is going to be hard for some of us to hear. It was really hard for me to hear this week while I studied for this. And I'll just tell you, I had to come to a place where I had to make peace with facts don't care about your feelings. Like, this is hard, Brad. I don't like the way this feels. Tough. It's true. This is the truth. And here's the fact, right? What we say and what we do in our anger towards another person reveals more about us than anyone else. Because it uncovers the true condition and environment within our hearts and our minds. The word raka that Jesus used means you're good for nothing, you're worthless, or you're empty. The word fool that Jesus used, right, that means when you say that to another person, when you call them a fool, when you call them an idiot, when you call them stupid, it means this: you have no skill, you are of no benefit, and you have nothing to offer. Both expressions of anger that Jesus describes, it reveals the truth of how we evaluate the worth and value of another human being. They're not just anger statements. They're value statements, loaded, aimed, and fired at another person. And there's a word for this kind of anger. It's actually called contempt. In contemptuous anger, here's what happens. When I have contemptuous anger towards another person, what I do is I put myself in the seat of the evaluator of their lives. Like I am now, because I hold you in contempt. Right? I am aiming contemptuous anger at you, right? So what that means is I am now the evaluator of your life and how you live your life and the things that you do and the things that you say. I now become the evaluator. I'm the one that's judging your life. And through my actions and through my words, I declare to you and to the world and to anyone else that's willing to listen to me over my social media feed, whatever it is, when I put you on blast, I have determined that you are good for nothing and you don't matter. And according to Jesus, contemptuous anger is an attempt to attack and kill somebody else's dignity, worth, and value, and erase their existence in our own hearts and minds and in the hearts and minds of others, which is the essence of the act of murder. That's what you're doing. Murder is a physical attempt to erase someone's existence. Anger is the same thing. You're trying to erase their dignity and their worth and their value. Murder is an attempt on someone's life. Anger is an attempt on their soul. And now you can see why it's such a big deal to Jesus. Again, Tim Mackey says this: in Jesus' mind, someone who continually expresses contemptuous anger towards another person is just as distorted in their heart and in their mind as a murderer. And according to Jesus, the crime of anger and contempt against another is just as punishable as the act of murder itself. One author I read this week puts it like this: murder is simply a downstream response to a heart posture and a mindset that started upstream when you called someone an idiot and believed you were right in doing so. Which means this, for me, just honest confession, right? It means that on most weekdays around 5:30, between 5 and 6 o'clock, when I'm leaving the office and trying to get home, I'm a serial killer. Right? There should be documentaries made for the crime scenes that I leave up and down 64 in the Gene Snyder. The other place you could do that is when I watch UK football play, right? It's the same kind of thing. There's so many dead referees, right, in my mind. And we can laugh at this, right? We can go, oh, yeah, me too. But here's the thing, and this is what Jesus, I think, would say to us. We can't stand and make self-righteous statements about the sanctity of life when we assassinate people's souls with our words. You can't stand and make a self-righteous statement about life is so valuable when in your heart and in your mind, you're a serial killer. Those two things don't go together. Those two things can't coexist. Because Jesus says, really, if you're willing to say that here, if you're willing to let that live here and here, it's just a matter of time before it comes out here. You're already there. And that's going to be kind of a theme that recurs as we go forward into Jesus' Bill of Rights. He's like, listen, it's not about the technical act, right? It's not about the actions. It's not about the technicalities. It's the fact that in your heart and in your mind and in your soul, you're already there. Yeah, maybe you haven't actually killed someone, but you're already there in your heart. You're already there in your soul. You're already there in your mind. So you'd obviously be worried. I'd obviously be worried. We would be worried if we were going to be found guilty of the act of murder, like we would be concerned, right? But according to Jesus, we should be just as concerned when it comes to being found guilty of contempt and anger towards another person. See, for Jesus, it's heart over action. This is not about you and I avoiding the technicality of actually murdering someone. It's not like one of those things when you get to heaven, it's like, well done, good and faithful servant, congratulations, you didn't kill anybody your whole life. Right? That's not what we'll hear. You did it. Well done. Way to go. Good job. Jesus cares more about breaking and shifting this attitude and mindset within us that believes it's okay to evaluate and attack and kill the worth and value and dignity of another human being. That's what Jesus wants to change. That's what Jesus says, unacceptable. Doesn't work in my kingdom. It's not just about stopping short with your actions. It's about, let's deal with the fact that in your heart, your mind, your soul, you're already there. In your heart and your mind and your soul, let's just be real, right? In your heart and mind and soul, the people that maybe they've wronged you, the people that have hurt you, the people that you're angry at, that have disappointed you, that have let you down, you may not actually take their life, but in your heart and your mind and your soul, you thought about it. If I could just take this out on, if I could just erase their existence, my life would be better if they weren't a part of it. Ever thought that? If they were just gone. That's what Jesus is talking about. You've already gone there. The act of murder has already happened in your heart and your mind and your soul. See, Jesus, he's calling us up to something greater in his kingdom, and he's got a really unique and clever way of doing that. And this is where I like Jesus' genius blows me away, right? If you read back through verses 21 and 22, you'll see there are 3 offenses, and then there are 3 punishments that go with those offenses, right? The 3 offenses are murder, anger, and insults, which those decrease in severity, right? Murder, big deal. Anger, big deal. An insult, even back in Jesus' day, like for us, it is not a big deal for us from the safety of our own vehicles to hurl insults at other drivers, or from what we feel like is the perceived anonymity of our phones or our computers to absolutely take down someone with our words on social media posts. Insults for us aren't that big of a deal. Wasn't that big of a deal in Jesus' day either. People did it all the time. So murder, big deal. Anger, big deal. Insults, So they decrease in severity. But if you look at the punishments that go along with those, they increase in severity, right? Murder, you're going to go to the local court. You'll face judgment at the local court. Anger, you're going to go to the Supreme Court. Insults, the hell of fire. Right? If we're going by the way our culture operates, that should be flipped. It's nothing for us to call somebody stupid. It's a big deal to murder someone. Jesus says they're actually the same. See, Jesus cares about the conditions of our hearts and our minds so much so that in his kingdom culture, he flips the norm to put safeguards in place. One, to prevent our hearts and minds from going someplace upstream that could potentially lead to something downstream that brings harm to ourselves and others. And the second reason he does this is to help us live out our kingdom calling to be salt and light. You cannot evangelize and lead people to Jesus and hate people at the same time. It just doesn't work. I know you're shocked. It just doesn't work. To live the way that Jesus is lining out for us is noticeably different from everyone and everything else, which is why Jesus, he really cares about it, and it's why he's raising the bar from technicality up to truth. He's doing this because he cares about you. And he cares about reaching others and advancing his kingdom through us. Jesus chooses to involve us in his mission. He chooses us. And that's what's revealed in this legal piece, right? In the law, according to Jesus and his kingdom. So that's the legal part, right? That reveals Jesus' heart and his desire for us. So here's how we're going to wrap up today. Like we're going to wrap up by talking about the life application part, which if you thought that part was hard, here's what's coming, right? What we're getting ready to talk about is how this plays out practically in our lives. How our lives function and how they operate. Because here's the truth, church. How we live reveals Jesus' heart for others through us. People will assume, they will make assumptions about who Jesus is based on how you live. They will make assumptions when it comes to what they think, or how they think Jesus feels about them based on how you treat them. So this is why this matters. This is why Jesus says, listen, here's the rule, here's the law, here's how you live it out. It says this starting in verse 23. Jesus says, so, which means in light of now understanding the link between anger and murder, if you're offering your gift at the altar, if you're coming to church on a Sunday, before you go offer this gift, even if you're on your way to church, which the reason this would have been a big deal back in Jesus' day is when you're on your way to the altar, like nothing stopped you. Like when you were headed to the altar to deliver your sacrifice, whatever it was, when you were going to the temple to worship, you went to the temple, no one missed church on Sunday. And Jesus says, listen, hey, if you're on your way to the temple, if you're on your way to the altar, which I know nobody misses, if you're on your way and you remember that somebody has something against you, stop what you're doing, turn around, leave your gift there before the altar and go. I want you to catch this, because I think we can read past this pretty quickly and miss what Jesus says. He's not saying, if you have a problem, if you remember, even if you're sitting in church on a Sunday, if you remember, man, I got a problem with somebody. He's not saying if you have a problem with them, but it's if you remember and you realize somebody's got a problem with me. See, there are times, I think, that we know that we are directly responsible for someone else's anger towards us. Our actions are the reason that anger and contempt is starting to take root and is starting to run from upstream to downstream in somebody else's life. Like we're the reason, we're behind that. And what our culture would say is they would look at that situation where somebody's got something against you and say, listen, you don't have a problem with them, they've got a problem with you. If they want to deal with it, they know where they can find you. But Jesus' kingdom culture is different. And what Jesus is saying in the life application piece, and this is the hard part, he said, don't wait for the person that you've hurt to find you. Be salt and light. Live different. You go find them. You take responsibility for your irresponsibility and anger and go deal with it. Urgently. Go deal with it. Why? Because your irresponsibility is now causing contempt and anger to run and rule and reign and rule in somebody else's life. So how do we deal with it? How do we do this? Jesus lines out two ways, right? Two things that must be done to deal with anger. Here's what he says in verse 24. He says, first, be reconciled to your brother, and then come offer your gift. So the first thing that Jesus talks about is reconciliation. Reconciliation is a change within our hearts and our souls. It's a change within our minds. It's a change within our being. It's a shift in who we are. Reconciliation is the action of the heart and the mind. It is our care for another in our hearts and our concern for them in our minds. We're actually going to talk more about this next week, but care and concern for other people are actually the byproduct of love. See, anger would cause us to devalue and diminish another person's worth and dignity, but reconciliation, right, that care and concern for others in our hearts and minds results in expressions of love that recognizes, instills, and installs value, worth, and dignity in others. And I'll just tell you this, if you're not taking pictures of this, you probably should, right? Because this is what it looks like. Reconciliation is our recognition that we must take action to restore another person's proper value, worth, and dignity. And according to Jesus, that has to begin in our own hearts and minds and souls. Why? Because when we do that, love begins to replace anger. There's a swap, there's a trade. Love begins to take the place that contempt and anger we're living in. So the first thing Jesus calls us to is reconciliation. Verse 25, he says, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're still going with them to court. Bottom line is this: make sure you don't show up to court guilty, right? And this is all about resolution. So reconciliation is a change in our being. Resolution is a change in our doing. Resolution is how we actually face the problems that we caused in our anger, and we deal with it as Jesus would if he were us. See, resolution is the action, it's the doing. It's the action that we take to right the wrongs that we inflicted on others in our anger. It's what we do to make it right. And Jesus says, here's what happens if you don't do this. Your accuser will hand you over to the judge, and the judge will hand you over to the guard, and you will be put in prison. If you don't, the legal process takes over. If you're not willing to take responsibility for your irresponsibility and anger, then the legal process takes over, and at that point, that's what you're submitting to. So you can submit to Jesus and his kingdom and be someone who enters into the process of reconciliation, to be someone who enters into that process of restoration. Or you can submit to the legal process. You go to the judge hands you over to the guard takes you to prison, they lock you up. It's two deals on the table. Which one do you want? See, to deal with anger, to be a kingdom citizen as Jesus would desire us to do, to live this with God life that we talk about here at Adventure, we need to be people that move quickly to both reconciliation and resolution. We need to see reconciliation and resolution as matters of urgency. See, moving quickly to reconciliation in our hearts and our minds and our souls, what that does is that acknowledges the true importance and worth and value and dignity in the person that we hurt, in the person that God created. Reconciliation essentially does this: it looks at the person that we hurt and looks at God and says, I now see what you see. I see the value and worth that you see in this person. And I want to reconcile those. I want to bring those back into alignment. Moving quickly to resolution, what that does is expresses this authenticity in our actions, that we understand the significance of the problem that we may have caused in our anger, and it also expresses our willingness to make things right, whatever it takes. I want to make this right because I know I hurt you, and I know I was wrong, and I know in my irresponsibility, I may have planted the seed of contempt and anger in your life, and that may be growing. And that puts you at risk. And I don't want you to be at risk. So let's make this right. And as we land the plane today, here's what I want us to understand. Jesus isn't asking us to do something that he wasn't willing to do himself. Romans chapter 5, verse 6 through 8. Paul says this, he says, when we were utterly helpless, incapable of fixing things on our own, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners. Now, most people, he says, would not be willing to die for an upright person, though some might perhaps be willing to die for someone who's especially good. But God showed his great love for us, meaning this: God showed us how much we were worth. God reconciled and brought resolution to our value, our worth, and our dignity by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners, while our sin created a vacuum of worthlessness created a vacuum of valuelessness, took away our dignity. God says, I'm going to restore that. I'm going to resolve that brokenness. I'm going to reconcile this relationship. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul says this, is therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. Your value, your worth, and your dignity have been restored to you by Christ. You're a new creation. The old has passed away, and behold, the new has come. All of this, Paul says, is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself. Which means this, in God's heart, mind, and soul, he declares you valuable. He declares you someone who is dignified. How much are you worth? The life of his son. But then he's also given us the ministry of reconciliation. See, we've been reconciled to be reconcilers. Paul says, therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. God makes his appeal for reconciliation and resolution through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Do you realize that an ambassador, we know this, because within our systems of government, an ambassador is an official role and a position. When you're made an ambassador, you go represent whoever made you that ambassador. You represent the country and the leadership of that country to another country. You're the ambassador. I'm here to reflect the values of my country and my leader to this other country. Jesus, right, what we find in 2 Corinthians, what Paul says is that Jesus, right, he has made us ambassadors. He has appointed us and promoted us in his kingdom to be his representatives to the world. You can't do that through hate and anger. You reflect something different when contempt and anger take root in your heart. See, I think in our culture, I don't think it's a stretch to say that we've normalized contempt and anger towards others. We've made that kind of a normal thing. Our leaders do it. Speed the leader, speed the team. We follow. It's okay to say anything I want to anybody. It doesn't matter. But again, I just want to remind you of this. What you say to others, what you say about others, what you say in front of people, whether it's out loud, physically, or on social media, it says more about you than anything else. And so what I'm calling us to do, church, my challenge, and I think Jesus' challenge to us is this: normalize reconciliation and resolution. What would happen if instead of continuing to normalize contempt and anger towards others, what would happen if we as believers begin to normalize reconciliation? I see value in you. I see what God sees in you. What would happen if we normalized resolution? I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. What would happen in your life if the heart posture and the mindset recognized the value and worth of the people around you, and then through your actions, you were willing to take whatever action was needed to make things right again? What would happen? I think it'd be remarkable. I think people would notice there's something different. Your life looks different. There's something noticeable in you. Yeah. I belong to a kingdom. And I follow a king, and this is where he leads me. So what we're getting ready to celebrate as we take communion, our ushers are going to come forward and begin to pass that. We celebrate tangibly what reconciliation and resolution look like. When we take communion, we take a piece of bread that represents Jesus' body and that cup of juice that represents his blood that was shed for us and poured out for us. This is what it takes. God sees value in you. He sees dignity in you. He sees worth in you. And it's not just that he sees and he recognizes it. He takes action then to make sure that it's resolved, that any kind of conflict between us and him, any kind of disconnect between us and him is resolved. God is a God of reconciliation and resolution. And he does that through Christ. He did that through death on a cross. And so my challenge to us as we sit and we think about this, about the trail of bodies we may have left behind us through our insults and anger toward other people. No one is too far gone or too broken. No one is a lost cause to Jesus. And even though there may be a disconnect, he can bring those things back into alignment. He can reconcile and resolve the anger that lives within us. And he can replace that with the ability to be loved by God and love others like God. And I think that's a big thing. I think for some of us, it's impossible for us to imagine being loved by God, because all we've experienced is anger directed towards us, and so that's now all we have to direct towards others. But Jesus, in that resolution and reconciliation, makes it possible for you to be loved by the author and creator of everything. And when you are loved by God, you can begin to love like him. In this time, as we worship together, if you want to pray together today, I'd love to pray with you. If you want to accept Christ today, if you want to talk more about what it means to devote your life to Christ, to hand your life over to Jesus, I would love to meet you down front. If you want to join our church, we'd love to meet you down front. And if coming down front ain't your thing, we can meet in the back after service. But I'm going to pray, we're going to take communion, and then we'll worship together. Jesus, we are so grateful for your mercy and for your love that restores and resolves and reconciles the conflict between us, that deals with sin, deals with our brokenness in a way that we are made whole. So God, I know right now, many of us, myself included, are sitting in these seats and in this place of conviction. Father, I pray that conviction would lead to action. I pray that you would protect our hearts and minds from shame. And that's the exact thing that our enemy wants to do, is he wants to turn conviction into shame, and shame sets up like concrete, and then we can't move. We can't make any moves because we're so ashamed of ourselves. God, you do not shame us. You convict our hearts to lead us to action. So, Father, I pray for the reconciliation and resolution conversations that may happen in the coming days. Lord, would your Spirit begin preparing the hearts of those that we may need to come to and say, listen, I need to take responsibility for my irresponsibility. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. Father, I pray for healing in relationships. I pray for mercy and forgiveness to be offered. That Jesus, as we sit here and we drink this juice and we eat this bread that represents your forgiveness to us, Lord, that we would be able to extend that to someone else. Pray to receive that from others. Jesus, we love you. We pray all this in your name.